What if reality is just a dumb little rule looping forever, like my hip thrust routine, but at universe scale? Stephen Wolfram says you don't need fancy equations to get cosmic drama. Start with tiny squares, cellular automata. Give them a super simple rule, and low-key you get stripes, chaos, galaxies in my notebook vibes. That's the plot twist. Simple rules, wild complexity. Here's the scary cute part: computational irreducibility. Some systems can't be shortcut. You can't know the ending without running every step. No spoilers, bestie. You gotta do the reps. Yes, like glutes. Wolfram's physics take. Imagine reality as a giant hypergraph, points and connections, updated by local rewrite rules. Space is just who's connected to who. Particles, stable little patterns surfing those updates. We as observers compress all that into a story that feels like space, time, and stuff bumping into stuff. And the Ruliad? Think the tangled limit of all possible rules. We live inside one consistent slice our brains can follow. Different observers, different slices. But when we translate between them, boom, math works, physics behaves, and my squat depth is still controversial. Kinda broke me. If there's no shortcut, unpredictability isn't chaos. It's where free will vibes live. You want outcomes? Run the computation. Do the set. Observe the pump. Brain rot moment. Maybe the universe isn't designed. It's performed. One more rep, one more update. See you next.
Who is the Gift Father? The Gift Father, also known as Winter's Heart, Santa Claus, and the Judge in Scarlet, is a multi-planar true god of reward, punishment, and cyclical renewal, whose influence is felt across many thousands of universes. Though the Gift Father spends almost all of his time in his own micro-universe, the glacial plain and factory city of Notre-Pole, he, quite famously, periodically departs his home for a single, nearly endless night to visit and bestow gifts upon the uncountable number of sentient beings who hold him in regard. To those deemed righteous by the Gift Father's inscrutable moral scale, he appears as a jolly, warm, and wise elder who leaves delightful presents and good cheer in his wake. To those judged as wicked or cruel, however, he appears as a wretched abomination, clad in tattered rags of crimson, and in place of gifts leaves cursed items, the physical manifestation of the recipient's wrongdoings. The very worst offenders receive nothing and are instead thrown into the Gift Father's sack before being transported back to Notre-Pole, where their bodies and souls are consumed within the great furnaces that power the Gift Father's eternal factories.
Like the point we know from geometry, it has no size, no dimension. It's just an imaginary idea that indicates a position in a system. A second point, then, can be used to indicate a different position. But it, too, is of indeterminate size. To create the first dimension, all we need is a line joining any 2 points. A first-dimensional object has length only, no width or depth. If we now take our first-dimensional line and draw a second line crossing the first, we've entered the second dimension. The object we're representing now has a length and a width, but no depth. To help us with imagining the higher dimensions, we're going to represent our second-dimensional object as being created using a second line which branches off from the first. Now let's imagine a race of two-dimensional creatures called flatlanders. What would it be like to be a flatlander living in their two-dimensional world? A two-dimensional creature would have only length and width, as if they were the royalty on an impossibly flat playing card. Picture this. A flatlander couldn't possibly have a digestive tract because the pipe from their mouth to their bottom would divide them into 2 pieces. And a flatlander trying to view our three-dimensional world would only be able to perceive shapes in two-dimensional cross-sections. A balloon, for instance, would start as a tiny dot, become a hollow circle which inexplicably grows to a certain size, then shrinks back to a dot before popping out of existence. And we three-dimensional human beings would seem very strange indeed to a flatlander. Imagining the third dimension is the easiest for us because every moment of our lives, that's what we're in. A three-dimensional object has length, width, and height. But here's another way to describe the third dimension. If we imagine an ant walking across a newspaper which is lying on a table, we can pretend that the ant is a flatlander, walking along on a flat two-dimensional newspaper world. If that paper is now folded in the middle, We create a way for our Flatlander ant to magically disappear from one position in his two-dimensional world and be instantly transported to another. We can imagine that we did this by taking a two-dimensional object and folding it through the dimension above, which is our third dimension. Once again, it'll be more convenient for us as we imagine the higher dimensions if we can think of the third dimension in this way. The third dimension is what you fold through to jump from one point to another in the dimension below. Okay, the first three dimensions can be described with these words: length, width, and depth. What word can we assign to the fourth dimension? One answer would be duration. If we think of ourselves as we were 1 minute ago, and then imagine ourselves as we are at this moment, the line we could draw from the 1 minute ago version to the right now version would be a line in the fourth dimension. If you were to see your body in the fourth dimension, you'd be like a long undulating snake, with your embryonic self at one end and your deceased self at the other. But because we live from moment to moment in the third dimension, we're like our second dimensional Flatlanders. Just like that Flatlander who could only see two-dimensional cross-sections of objects from the dimension above, we, as three-dimensional creatures, can only see three-dimensional cross-sections of our fourth-dimensional self. One of the most intriguing aspects of there being one dimension stacked on another is that down here in the dimensions below, we can be unaware of our motion in the dimensions above. Here's a simple example. If we make a Mobius strip, take a long strip of paper, add one twist to it and tape the ends together, and draw a line down the length of it, our line will eventually be on both sides of the paper before it meets back with itself. It appears, somewhat amazingly, that the strip has only one side, so it must be a representation of a two-dimensional object. And this means that a two-dimensional Flatlander, traveling down the line we just drew, would end up back where they started without ever feeling like they had left the second dimension. In reality, they would be looping and twisting in the third dimension, even though to them it felt like they were traveling in a straight line. The fourth dimension, time, feels like a straight line to us, moving from the past to the future. But that straight line in the fourth dimension is, like the Mobius strip, actually twisting and turning in the dimension above. So the long undulating snake that is us will feel like it is moving in a straight line in the fourth dimension, but there will actually be, in the fifth dimension, a multitude of paths that we could branch to at any given moment. Those branches will be influenced by our own choice, chance, and the actions of others. Quantum physics tells us that the subatomic particles that make up our world are collapsed from waves of probability simply by the act of observation. In the picture we are drawing for ourselves here, we can now start to see how each of us are collapsing the indeterminate wave of probable futures contained in the fifth dimension into the fourth dimensional line that we are experiencing as time. What if you wanted to go back into your own childhood and visit yourself? We can imagine folding the fourth dimension through the fifth, jumping back through time and space to get there. But what if you wanted to get to the world where, for example, you had created a great invention as a child that by now had made you famous and rich? We can imagine our fourth dimensional selves branching out from our current moment into the fifth dimension. But no matter where you go from here, the great child inventor timeline is not one of the available options in your current version of time. You can't get there from here, no matter how much choice, chance, and the actions of others become involved. There are only two ways you could get to that world. One would be to travel back in time, somehow trigger the events that caused you to come up with your invention, then travel forward in the fifth dimension to see one of the possible new worlds that might have resulted. But that would be taking the long way. The shortcut we could take would involve us folding the fifth dimension through the sixth dimension, which allows us to instantly jump from our current position to a different fifth dimensional line. In our description of the fourth dimension, we imagine taking the dimension below and conceiving of it as a single point. The fourth dimension is a line which can join the universe as it was 1 minute ago to the universe as it is right now. Or, in the biggest picture possible, we could say that the fourth dimension is a line which joins the Big Bang to one of the possible endings of our universe. Now, as we enter the seventh dimension, we're about to imagine a line which treats the entire sixth dimension as if it were a single point. To do that, we have to imagine all the possible timelines, which could have started from our Big Bang, joined to all the possible endings for our universe, a concept which we often refer to as infinity, and treat them all as a single point. So for us, a point in the seventh dimension would be infinity. All possible timelines, which could have or will have occurred from our Big Bang. When we describe infinity as being a point in the seventh dimension, we're only imagining part of the picture. If we're drawing a seventh dimensional line, we need to be able to imagine what a different point in the seventh dimension is going to be, because that's what our line is going to be joined to. But how can there be anything more than infinity? The answer is, there can be other completely different infinities created through initial conditions which are different from our own Big Bang. Different initial conditions will create different universes, where the basic physical laws such as gravity or the speed of light are not the same as ours. And the resulting branching timelines from that universe's beginning to all its possible endings will create an infinity which is completely separate from the one which is associated with our own universe. So the line we draw in the seventh dimension will join one of those infinities to another. And as boggling as the magnitude of what we're exploring here might be, if we were to branch off from that seventh dimensional line to draw a line to yet another infinity, we'd then be entering the eighth dimension. As we've explored already, we can jump from one point in any dimension to another simply by folding it through the dimension above. If our ant on the newspaper were a two-dimensional flatlander, then folding his two-dimensional world to the third dimension would allow him to magically disappear from one location and appear in a different one. As we're now imagining the ninth dimension, the same rules would apply. If we were to be able to instantaneously jump from one eighth-dimensional line to another, it would be because we're able to fold through the ninth dimension. Before we discuss the first dimension, we could say that we first started out with dimension 0, which is the geometrical concept of the point. A point indicates a location in a system, and each point is of indeterminate size. The first dimension then takes two of these points and joins them with a line. When we imagined the fourth dimension, it was as if we were treating the entirety of three-dimensional space in a particular state as a single point, and drawing a fourth-dimensional line to another point, representing space as it is in a different state. We often refer to the line we have just drawn as time. Then, in the seventh dimension, we treated all of the possible timelines which could be generated from our Big Bang as if this were a single point, and imagined drawing a line to a point representing all the possible timelines for a completely different universe. Now, as we enter the 10th dimension, we have to imagine all the possible branches for all the possible timelines of all the possible universes and treat that as a single point in the 10th dimension. So far, so good. But this is where we hit a roadblock. If we're going to imagine the 10th dimension as continuing the cycle and being a line, then we're going to have to imagine a different point that we can draw that line to. But there's no place left to go. By the time we have imagined all possible timelines for all possible universes as being a single point in the 10th dimension, it appears that our journey is done. In string theory, physicists tell us that superstrings vibrating in the 10th dimension are what create the subatomic particles which make up our universe, and all of the other possible universes as well. In other words, all possibilities are contained within the 10th dimension, which would appear to be the concept we have just built for ourselves, as we imagined the 10 dimensions built one upon another.
Most people imagine heaven as a single place, one bright realm above the clouds. But according to the ancient book of Enoch, heaven isn't one world at all. It's 10. 10 stacked dimensions above creation, each stranger, darker, and more overwhelming than the last. Some shine brighter than the sun, others imprison spirits in endless torment, and a few contain beings so powerful, Enoch said a human mind would collapse in their presence. And in this video, we're breaking down what the ancient text says each heaven actually looks like, who or what lives there, and why several levels are described as absolutely terrifying. If you want me to turn this into a full series where I cover the creatures and rulers of every realm, comment 2 right now so I know to continue. In the first heaven, Enoch is taken upward by holy angels and brought into a realm that functions as the boundary between earth and the higher heavens, a place closely connected to the natural world, where angels are assigned to oversee the movements of clouds, rain, wind, snow, and the cycles of the seasons, not as chaotic forces but as part of a precise divine order, showing that this level of heaven is structured and purposeful rather than frightening. And as Enoch ascends into the second heaven, the atmosphere shifts slightly because this realm is described as a place of restraint, where certain fallen angels who abandoned their original roles are held under supervision, not in torment yet, but in confinement, guarded by obedient angels who ensure divine justice is maintained, making this heaven more solemn than terrifying, a place of waiting rather than punishment. And then Enoch is taken into the third heaven, where the contrast becomes clearer, because this is where paradise exists, a beautiful realm prepared for the righteous, filled with peace and light. Yet nearby Enoch is shown that separation still exists, with angels appointed as overseers and judges ensuring balance between mercy and justice, revealing that even within heaven, order is maintained through powerful beings whose role is not fear, but authority. And these first three heavens show that the heavenly realms are layered, organized, and purposeful, setting the foundation for what Enoch will encounter as he continues upward. In the fourth heaven, Enoch is brought into a realm unlike the peaceful order of the lower heavens, because this level governs the great cosmic systems that shape reality itself, where angelic beings are assigned to oversee the movement of the sun and the moon, regulating light, time, and seasons with exact precision. And here Enoch witnesses angels who record the cycles of creation, ensuring that nothing in the universe moves without permission, making this heaven feel vast and powerful rather than frightening, yet overwhelming in its scale. And as he ascends into the fifth heaven, the atmosphere becomes more emotionally intense, because this is where Enoch encounters the Watchers who fell, not imprisoned in torment yet, but existing in a state of sorrow and awareness. Angels who once held high authority, now stripped of their roles, watching the heavens they can no longer enter. And what makes this realm unsettling is not fear, but regret, as these beings mourn what they lost, serving as a warning about disobedience rather than a place of terror. And then Enoch is taken into the sixth heaven, where the tone shifts again, because this realm is filled with powerful angels responsible for maintaining the structure of the universe itself, beings who oversee the balance of cosmic laws, the flow of spiritual energy, and the harmony between realms. Angels who do not speak much but act constantly, moving with purpose and intelligence beyond human comprehension, giving this heaven a feeling of immense authority and control rather than danger. And finally, Enoch ascends into the seventh heaven, a realm closer to the divine presence, where the environment becomes almost impossible to describe, filled with radiant beings, countless angels singing, moving, and fulfilling roles tied directly to the will of God, where heavenly creatures of higher rank exist, not monstrous or terrifying, but overwhelmingly powerful in their purity and presence. And this heaven represents a threshold, a place where divine order is most visible, where everything operates in perfect alignment, showing that as Enoch moves higher, heaven becomes less about fear and more about responsibility, authority, and proximity to something infinitely greater, preparing him for the realms that exist beyond what most beings are ever allowed to witness. In the eighth heaven, Enoch is taken into a realm that feels fundamentally different from everything below it, because this is where the structure and order of the heavens themselves are maintained, a domain inhabited by exalted angelic beings whose sole purpose is to preserve balance, alignment, and continuity across all other realms. And Enoch describes these angels as radiant and precise, moving in perfect coordination, not reacting emotionally or unpredictably, but operating with complete awareness of their role, as if every action they take sends consequences cascading downward through creation. Their presence is overwhelming, because they embody authority without chaos, power without rebellion, and motion without rest, making it clear that heaven at this level is less about beauty and more about function, a place where divine order is actively sustained rather than symbolized. As Enoch ascends further into the ninth heaven, the environment becomes quieter, heavier, and more intense, because this realm is described as being extremely close to the divine presence, inhabited by the highest-ranking angels whose existence is defined entirely by alignment with God's will, beings who do not travel freely between realms and are rarely described in detail, not because they are hidden, but because their nature is beyond human comprehension, and Enoch explains that language itself becomes insufficient here, as these angels are not perceived as individual figures, but as manifestations of light, fire, and intelligence so concentrated that even other angels approach with reverence, making this heaven feel less like a place and more like a threshold where individuality begins to dissolve, and everything that exists does so in direct relation to divine authority. Finally, Enoch is brought into the 10th heaven, the highest and most sacred of all realms, where the throne of God is established and surrounded by the greatest hosts of angels, including the highest orders, whose sole purpose is to glorify, serve, and execute divine judgment. And Enoch describes this realm not as chaotic or terrifying in a conventional sense, but as incomprehensible, filled with a brilliance so intense that it overwhelms thought itself, where time no longer behaves as it does in lower heavens, and where even angels exist only by permission, fully aware of their place within an absolute hierarchy. And standing within this realm, Enoch realizes that as one ascends higher through the heavens, the concept of comfort disappears entirely, replaced by an overwhelming awareness of power, separation, and order, revealing that heaven is not a single peaceful destination, but a vast layered system of authority and responsibility, where every being, no matter how powerful, exists in service to something infinitely greater. Completing Enoch's journey through the 10 heavens and leaving behind a vision of heaven that is structured, purposeful, and far more complex than anything humanity was ever taught to imagine.